I am one of the only men who walked out of Red Creek in 1959. That is not a phrase I am proud of. It is a sentence that followed me for the rest of my life. People assume surviving means escaping. They are wrong. What happened that night did not end when we left the woods. It stayed in our bodies, in our sleep, and in the things we refused to talk about. We did not see a wolf the way you imagine one. What came out of the dark moved wrong, sounded wrong, and did not behave like anything meant to exist. We were close enough to smell it, close enough to feel its breath before we understood we were being hunted. Most men who went in never came back. Those of us who did were never the same. Before I tell you what followed us out of Red Creek, understand this. We are not here to convince you. We are here because the truth does not disappear just because it is buried. If you want stories that were never meant to be told, subscribe now, because once you hear what really happened in the dark, you will not be able to unhear it. I did not go into Red Creek because I was brave or curious or chasing something I could not name. Because the truth is far simpler and far more embarrassing. We went in because we believed the land was empty, because the maps said so, because the men who sold us the permits laughed when we asked about animals, and because nothing is more dangerous than a group of men who think the worst thing waiting for them is cold weather and bad footing. The forest around Red Creek did not feel wild in the way forests usually do. It felt managed, restrained, as if something had pressed it flat and told it to behave, and even the trees seemed to grow closer together than they should have, their branches tangling overhead in a way that blocked out the sky, long before night fully arrived, which meant that when darkness came, it did not fall gradually, but instead dropped all at once like a door being slammed shut. We noticed the silence first, not the absence of birds or insects in the abstract way people describe later, but the physical sensation of sound being swallowed, of our own footsteps sounding wrong, too loud and yet somehow distant at the same time, as if the forest were listening rather than echoing. And that was when the first man turned around and asked if anyone else felt like we were already late for something we had not agreed to attend. I remember the smell changing as we moved deeper, the clean, damp scent of water, giving way to something heavier, something metallic and old, like rust soaked into wet soil. And I remember thinking that Red Creek did not smell like running water at all, but like something that had been standing still for a very long time, watching everything that passed by, without ever needing to move. We made camp too close to the creek, closer than we should have, because the ground there was flat and clear, and because exhaustion makes you careless in ways that feel reasonable at the time. And when the fire finally took, and the light pushed back the dark just enough to let us see each other's faces, I noticed how relieved everyone looked to be visible again. How quickly men will trade caution for comfort when they think the worst is behind them. That was when the sounds began. At first it was only the water, except it did not sound like water. It sounded like something moving beneath it, slow and deliberate, displacing the current rather than flowing with it. And as we listened, the noise grew heavier, accompanied by a low vibration that I felt through the ground before I fully recognized it with my ears. A sensation that made my teeth ache and my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Someone said, "Wolf." No one laughed. The sound that followed was not a howl, but something closer to breathe, long and controlled, released through a throat that was far too large. And it came from so close to the edge of the firelight that I realized with sudden clarity that whatever was making it had been standing there long enough to understand exactly how far the light reached, and that it had chosen to remain just outside of it. When it moved, the ground responded, not with the light snapping of paws or the chaotic rush of an animal charging, but with the slow, weighted pressure of something upright shifting its balance. And in that moment, before panic took hold, before anyone screamed or ran or reached for a weapon, I understood that we were not being approached. We were being assessed. The first man to break was not the youngest or the weakest. He was the one who had been smiling the most an hour earlier. the one who kept talking about how quiet the place was and how good it felt to be away from towns and people and noise. And when he stood up too fast and stepped backward into the dark beyond the fire, the sound that came out of him was not a shout, but a sharp intake of breath that ended abruptly, as if something had reached out and closed a hand around his lungs. I remember how the fire reacted, how it flared suddenly as if fed by a rush of air that did not exist, throwing light farther than it had any right to. And for the briefest moment I saw movement, not fully, not clearly, but enough to register height where there should not have been height, mass where there should not have been mass, and a shape that suggested limbs arranged in a way that made my mind recoil before it could finish forming the image. What struck me most was the restraint. If it had charged, if it had rushed us with the blind aggression of a starving animal, we might have responded on instinct, might have scattered or fought or done something foolish and human, but instead, it circled the edge of the clearing with a patience that felt rehearsed, stepping into view just long enough for us to understand that it wanted to be seen, and then withdrawing again before we could fully lock our eyes on it. The sounds it made were deliberate, paced, spaced out in a way that drew our attention to the gaps between them, because silence is far more effective when it arrives exactly where you expect noise to continue. And in those gaps I could hear my own blood rushing, could feel my heartbeat misaligning with my breathing, could sense the exact moment when rational thought began to slide away. When the second man was taken, it happened without warning, no build-up, no dramatic moment, only the sudden collapse of the darkness itself as something moved through it faster than my eyes could track, followed by a sound that I still hear in my dreams, a wet tearing noise that ended in a single sharp impact, as if a body had been thrown against the ground with tremendous force. We did not see him go. We only saw what was left behind. The ground where he had been standing was torn up in deep, uneven gouges that looked less like claw marks and more like impressions left by something gripping the earth to anchor itself. And scattered across the dirt were pieces of fabric and bone arranged in a way that suggested precision rather than chaos, as if whatever had done this had taken the time to choose where everything fell. That was when we ran. Not together, not with any coordination or plan, but in a blind, desperate surge away from the creek and deeper into the trees. Because terror does not point you towards safety, it only points you away from what you cannot survive. And as we crashed through undergrowth and roots and low branches, I became painfully aware of the fact that the sounds behind us were not chasing sounds. They were keeping pace. Every time I thought I had pulled ahead, every time I dared to believe that distance was growing between me and the thing in the dark, the sound of its breathing would reappear just behind my right ear, steady and unlabored, close enough that I could feel warmth, where there should have been only cold night air. And in that moment, I understood the truth that would define the rest of my life. The Red Creek wolf did not hunt to kill, it hunted to choose. I do not know how long I ran before I realized that running had become pointless, because the forest no longer responded to my movement in a way that suggested escape, every direction folding back into itself with the same suffocating density of trees and shadow, the same low-hanging branches clawing at my face and arms, the same uneven ground that twisted beneath my feet as if the earth itself were shifting to keep me exactly where I was meant to be. At some point, the sounds of the others disappeared, not all at once but gradually, one set of crashing footsteps dropping away here, a shouted name cutting off there, until the only sound left was my own breathing and the steady, impossible calm of something moving alongside me without ever touching the ground the way I did, matching my speed without effort, without urgency, without any sign that it needed to hurry. I slowed without deciding to, my legs burning and my chest screaming for air. And when I finally stumbled into a small clearing that looked wrong in the way everything at Red Creek looked wrong, too symmetrical, too open, I felt a wave of relief so intense it made me weak, because part of me believed that open space meant safety, meant visibility, meant a chance to understand what I was facing. The relief lasted only seconds. The darkness at the edge of the clearing thickened, not like shadow but like substance, and from it stepped a shape that resolved slowly, deliberately, as if it understood that fear deepens when the mind is forced to assemble what the eyes refuse to accept all at once. And as more of it became visible, I realized with a sickening clarity that calling it a wolf had been a lie. We told ourselves to stay sane. It stood upright. Not awkwardly, not like an animal forced into a posture it did not belong in, but comfortably, with a balance and confidence that suggested long familiarity with that position, its legs bent slightly at the knee, its weight distributed in a way that made it seem anchored to the ground rather than merely standing on it. And as it stepped fully into the faint moonlight, I saw the suggestion of fur, thick and dark and uneven, clinging to a frame that was far too tall and far too broad to belong to anything natural. Its head was wrong. The shape of it carried enough resemblance to a wolf to trigger recognition, but the proportions were distorted, the jaw longer, the skull heavier, the mouth capable of opening wider than it ever should have. And when it breathed, the movement traveled through its chest and shoulders like a slow rolling tide, unhurried, controlled, confident in the knowledge that nothing in front of it could challenge its claim to the space. It did not rush me. It did not growl or snarl or bare its teeth in the way stories prepare you for. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, the motion precise and almost curious, and fixed its gaze on me with eyes that reflected no light at all, eyes that did not shine or glow or flicker, but absorbed everything they looked at. And in that gaze, I felt stripped of every comforting illusion I had ever carried about my place in the world. I understood then that it was not interested in my fear. It was interested in my response. When I did not move, when I stood there shaking and exposed and utterly aware of my own insignificance, the creature took one slow step closer, close enough that I could see the scars along its body, old marks layered over older ones. Evidence not of survival but of continuity, as if this thing had been doing exactly this for a very long time. And then, without warning, it turned away. It stepped back into the darkness with the same deliberate calm it had arrived with, leaving me alone in the clearing, alive, untouched, and absolutely certain that this had not been mercy. It had been selection. I stayed in that clearing long after the thing disappeared, frozen not by fear alone but by the unbearable weight of realization. Because being spared does not feel like relief when you understand that survival has been granted for a reason you do not yet know. And as the night dragged on and the sounds of the forest cautiously returned, I began to grasp the shape of the trap I had been placed inside. The Red Creek wolf had not been thinning us randomly. It had been isolating us. When dawn finally began to bleed weak gray light through the trees, I moved again, every step cautious and deliberate, listening for any sign that I was no longer alone. And it was then that I found the first of the others, or rather what remained of him, arranged at the base of a tree as if carefully positioned rather than discarded, his body intact enough to recognize but altered in subtle ways that made my stomach turn. His chest was open. Not torn apart in a frenzy, not ravaged by teeth and claws in the way animals feed, but split cleanly, the ribs separated with a precision that suggested strength guided by intention. And as I stared at the empty cavity where his heart should have been, I understood with horrifying clarity that this thing was not killing to eat. It was removing something. I did not touch the body. I did not speak his name. I backed away slowly, my thoughts spiraling as I began to recall the stories we had laughed off before coming here, the half-whispered accounts of people found intact but emptied, of missing organs with no signs of scavenging, of wounds that looked more like surgical work than violence. And as these memories surfaced, I realized that Red Creek was not a hunting ground. It was a processing site, The rest of the survivors emerged slowly as the morning wore on, one by one, drawn together not by any conscious decision but by the shared pull of trauma, each of us carrying the same hollow look, the same stiffness of movement, the same unspoken understanding that something fundamental had been taken from the group as a whole, even from those of us who still breathed. We did not ask each other what we had seen. We did not need to. The silence between us was heavy with confirmation, and when one man finally broke it by saying that he felt wrong inside, lighter somehow, as if a weight he had never known was gone, I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the cold, because I felt it too. Something had changed. Not just in our bodies, but in the way the world seemed to press against us, in the way sounds arrived slightly dulled, in the way emotions felt muted, distant, as if filtered through a layer of something thick and resistant. And as we made our way out of Red Creek together, I became increasingly certain that the reason we had been allowed to live was not because we had escaped. It was because we were no longer finished. The Red Creek wolf had taken what it needed, and it had left us behind to see what would happen next. We reached the edge of the forest in a state that I can only describe as unfinished, not wounded in the obvious sense, not bleeding, not limping, not carrying the kind of injuries that would force a man to admit he was broken, but altered in a way that made every movement feel slightly delayed, as if my body was waiting for permission from something that was no longer me. And as the trees thinned and the sky opened up, I expected the simple normality of daylight to swallow the nightmare whole. I expected my mind to snap back into its familiar shape the moment I saw a road, a fence line, a telephone pole, any proof that human life still existed. But the air outside Red Creek felt just as heavy, and the sunlight did not feel like safety. It felt like exposure. We found the road by accident, because none of us remembered the path we had taken in, which should have been impossible given that men like us prided ourselves on direction and competence. But something about the place had scrambled our sense of distance and sequence, as if ours had been cut out and stitched back in the wrong order. And when we finally stumbled onto gravel and realized we were standing on a service route that should have been familiar, the relief did not arrive. Instead, we exchanged looks that carried the same sick understanding, because the world beyond the forest was intact, but we were not. The first truck that stopped for us belonged to a man who did not ask questions the way a sensible person would. He stared at our faces as if he recognized something and did not want to say it out loud. And when he offered water, his hands shook so badly that half of it spilled. And I remember the taste of that water being wrong, not dirty, not metallic, simply wrong, as if my mouth could no longer agree with the world on what was real. He drove us into town with the radio off, which is something people do when they are afraid of their own thoughts, and the silence in the cab became unbearable. Because every time the truck hit a bump, I felt a vibration rise through the seat and travel up my spine in the exact rhythm of that breathing we had heard in the dark, steady and unhurried. And I began to suspect that the sound had not been outside me at all, that it had gotten in. At the clinic, the lights were too bright, and the smell of antiseptic made my stomach heave, and the nurse tried to speak calmly, but her eyes kept dropping to my throat, to my hands, to the bruising I had not noticed, until she pointed it out. Bruises shaped like fingers, not human fingers, longer, wider, placed with a grip that suggested I had been held upright like a tool. And when I told her we had been attacked, she asked by what, and I heard myself say the words Red Creek Wolf as if I had rehearsed them, as if the phrase had been planted in my mouth to make the story sound reasonable. The doctor examined us one by one, taking pulse, checking pupils, asking questions about head injuries and shock. And each time he leaned in close, I noticed the same reaction, the same slight recoil, the same fraction of a second when his expression tightened as if he had smelled smoke. And when he finally drew blood, the vial filled too fast, thicker than it should have been, and the doctor made a small noise in his throat that he tried to disguise as a cough. But I saw him glance at the syringe with a look I had only ever seen on a man who has just realized that the rules he trusts no longer apply. They kept us overnight, because they said it was protocol, because they said trauma does strange things, because they said dehydration and fear can create symptoms that feel supernatural. And I wanted to believe them so badly that I almost did, until the night settled and the clinic quieted, and I lay in a narrow bed staring at a ceiling tile that had a hairline crack running through it like a fault line, and I heard the breathing again, not in the hallway, not outside the window, but inside the room, slow and close, arriving in the exact pauses between my own breaths, as if something were practicing how to inhabit the space of me. I turned my head toward the window because I needed something to blame, some movement, some shadow, some proof that my fear had an object, and that was when I saw the mark on the glass. A smear at the height of a tall man, shaped like the drag of a palm, except it was too large, and the lines inside it were not fingerprints. They were ridges like grooves in bark, and as I stared, the smear darkened, as if moisture were seeping from the inside out, as if the window were sweating around the shape of a hand that was no longer there. I did not scream. I did not call the nurse. I lay perfectly still and listened to the breathing, because a part of me understood, with the cold certainty of a man who has been selected, that if I acknowledged it too loudly, if I gave it the satisfaction of being named, it would move from watching to claiming. By morning, the staff behaved differently, not openly, not in a way they could be accused of, but with the subtle carefulness of people who have seen something they cannot file away. And I noticed the way the doctor avoided meeting my eyes, the way he kept his voice low, the way the nurse who had offered water the day before now spoke to me as if I were an unpredictable animal. And when I asked about the blood work, he said it would take time, his tone too quick, too flat. And I understood that he had already seen something and decided not to tell me, which is the kind of silence that breeds terror faster than any scream. They released us at noon with instructions that did not match what we felt. Rest, fluids, no alcohol, return if symptoms worsen. As if this were an illness with a curve, as if what was inside us could be measured and monitored. And I walked out into sunlight that felt thin and brittle, the world around the clinic, moving with its ordinary rhythm, people in cars, a woman carrying groceries, a child tugging a sleeve, and I had the strangest urge to grab the first stranger I saw and beg them not to go near the trees, not to go near water, not to go near any place where darkness could gather into a shape. I went home alone, because none of the others could look at each other without flinching, and the drive felt endless, even though it was not. Every stretch of road lined with pines and scrub, every shadow between trunks forming a doorway in my peripheral vision, and each time I blinked I saw that clearing again, the upright silhouette, the eyes that swallowed light, and the way it had turned away as if my survival were not a gift, but a delay. At home, I did what men always do when they cannot cope. I tried to return to routine. I washed my hands until the skin reddened. I ate food I could barely taste. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the grain of the wood as if it could offer answers. And then I noticed something I had missed for hours, a smell that did not belong in my house, wet earth and rust and old water, the scent of Red Creek, faint but unmistakable, clinging to the corners like smoke that no amount of cleaning can remove. I followed it without thinking, room to room, closer and closer to the back door. And when I opened it, the air outside felt wrong, too still, and my yard, which should have been ordinary, looked staged. The grass slightly flattened as if something heavy had crossed it. The fence line bowed in one place, as if a hand had gripped the top rail. And along the edge where the lawn met the trees, I saw tracks that did not make sense. Deep impressions that began as something like footprints, and then stretched into long, dragged marks, as if whatever made them had been moving upright and then dropped down, not because it needed to, but because it wanted to remind me that it could move in more than one way. I told myself it was a bear. I told myself it was a prank. I told myself anything. But then I saw the second set of marks, closer to the house, and my stomach tightened, because these were not tracks. They were placements, deliberate and measured, a pattern that suggested pacing, not wandering. And when I looked up, I saw scratches on the siding near the corner of the building. too high to be accidental, too clean to be caused by weather. 3 long lines that cut through paint into wood, as if someone had tested the surface for weakness. The worst part was not that it had come. The worst part was that it had arrived silently, in daylight, in a place where it should not exist, as if distance did not apply to it, as if the rules that keep nightmares confined to remote woods were nothing more than a polite fiction. And as I stood there frozen on my back step, I realized that Red Creek had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of a process. The clinic had not protected us. The town had not saved us. Home had not closed the door, because the Red Creek wolf was not following our footprints. It was following what it had taken, and it was coming to see what it had made. I learned about the first death after Red Creek 3 days later, not from the newspaper or the police, but from a man who should not have been able to find me. A man whose voice sounded flattened when he spoke, as if it had passed through something dense before reaching my ear. And when he said my name, I knew immediately which survivor it was, because only one of us still pronounced it the way it used to be said. Slow and careful, like language mattered. He did not greet me. He did not explain why he was calling. He asked me if I had felt the pressure in my chest get worse at night, if I had noticed the way dreams no longer stayed inside sleep, if I had begun to wake with the certainty that someone had been standing just out of sight, waiting for permission to move closer. When I said yes, the silence on the other end of the line stretched until it became unbearable, and then he told me that another one of us was dead, not missing, not mauled, not torn apart in a way that would satisfy the need for explanation, but found seated at his own kitchen table with his hands folded neatly in front of him, his body untouched, his face calm in a way that suggested acceptance rather than fear. The coroner had listed the cause of death as cardiac failure. They always do when nothing else fits. But what made my blood run cold was the detail the caller whispered as if the walls could hear. The detail he said the authorities would not include, because they could not justify it, because it did not belong to any category they recognized. The man's chest had been opened. Not violently, not clumsily. Opened cleanly, carefully, with a precision that suggested familiarity. And inside there was nothing. Not damage, not blood loss, not trauma, but absence. A cavity where something essential had been removed, as if it had been scheduled, as if it had been retrieved when it was ready. That night I dreamed without sleeping. I was back in the clearing, except the trees were gone and the sky was low and heavy like a ceiling about to collapse. And the Red Creek wolf stood in front of me again, upright and massive, its shape clearer now, more defined, not because it had changed, but because I had, and when it looked at me, I understood something that made my stomach drop. It was not checking on me. It was waiting. When I woke, I was standing in my living room, barefoot on cold floorboards, my front door open to the night air, and the smell of Red Creek was stronger than it had ever been, thick enough to taste, and outside my house the yard was marked again, deeper this time, closer. The grass pressed flat in a wide arc as if something had stood there for a long while, considering the structure, memorizing angles, learning where walls were weakest. On my kitchen table lay something that had not been there when I went to bed. A strip of fabric, darkened with old blood, torn but not shredded, folded once and placed with care. And I recognized it immediately because it matched the jacket of the man who had died, the one found seated and emptied. And I understood with a clarity that made me nauseous that this was not a threat. It was a message. The Red Creek wolf was not hunting us one by one at random. It was finishing what it had started. The second survivor to die did not wait for the thing to come to him, which is what separated his end from the others and made it so much worse to consider, because fear can drive men toward violence or paralysis, but sometimes it drives them toward understanding they were never meant to reach, and he was the kind of man who needed answers more than safety. He went back. Not to Red Creek itself, but close enough to satisfy whatever pull had been growing inside him since the night we ran. close enough that the land began to feel compressed again, the air thickening as if it were being filtered through memory. And when his car was found abandoned along a dirt road with the doors open and the engine still warm, the authorities assumed confusion, shock, trauma-induced behavior. They never consider invitation. I found his journal later, delivered to my doorstep without explanation, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a knot that took me too long to undo because my hands would not stop shaking. And inside it, I read words written in a hand that grew less stable with every page, sentences looping back on themselves, phrases repeated and underlined, sketches of shapes that became more upright, more deliberate, more familiar the further I read. He wrote about hearing it speak, not with language, not with sound, but with pressure, with images placed behind the eyes, with urges that felt like his own until he resisted them and realized how much effort resistance required. And he wrote that the Red Creek Wolf did not see us as prey or enemies or even victims, but as containers, as structures capable of holding something that could be altered, removed, repurposed. The last entry was short. It said that he finally understood why we had been spared, because what the wolf took was not meat, it was choice. The police found him at the edge of the woods 2 days later, kneeling, facing the trees, his body intact, his chest unopened, his eyes wide and glassy with something that looked disturbingly like relief. And when they tried to move him, they discovered that his hands had fused to the ground beneath him, not through injury or decay, but through pressure so immense that skin and soil had become indistinguishable. They could not separate him without cutting him apart. They chose not to. After that, the remaining survivors stopped calling each other, not because we did not care, because we understood that connection drew attention, that whatever the Red Creek Wolf followed did not travel through distance or scent or sound, but through recognition, through shared memory, through the invisible thread that still bound us to the clearing and the selection that had taken place there. I stopped sleeping. Not out of fear of dreams, but because staying awake did not help, because whether my eyes were open or closed, I could feel the presence nearby, closer on some nights than others, always patient, always aware, as if it were waiting for the moment when I would finally understand what it expected of me. And slowly, against my will, a thought began to take shape, not of escape, not of survival, but of completion. Because if the Red Creek Wolf had taken something from us, and if it was now returning to see the results, then maybe the only way to stop it was not to hide or fight or run, but to finish what it had started, to give back what did not belong inside me anymore. The most terrifying realization of all was not that the wolf was coming again. It was that a part of me was beginning to wonder if that would be such a bad thing. I stopped resisting the pull. The moment I understood that resistance was exactly what had been studied, measured, and patiently dismantled, because every night I stayed awake, I felt the same internal pressure build, not like fear but like expectation, a sensation that settled behind my sternum and spread outward, filling my limbs with a heaviness that made movement feel optional, as if my body were preparing itself for a task it already knew how to perform. The dreams changed when I let them. They no longer replayed the night at Red Creek or the faces of the men who did not return. Instead, they showed me places I had never been, clearings that did not exist on any map, structures buried beneath soil and roots, chambers carved into earth and stone, where something had learned how to wait without decaying. And always at the center of these visions stood the Red Creek Wolf, upright and unmoving, its presence less threatening now and more instructional, like a teacher who has waited long enough for a student to arrive at the correct conclusion. I began to understand that Red Creek had never been unique. It was simply active. The land there had reached a point where it could sustain the process, where the conditions were correct for something ancient and patient to perform its work. And the reason the stories resurfaced every few decades was not because the wolf returned, but because the land called again, and something answered. The final message came without sound. I was sitting at my kitchen table in the early hours before dawn, the house silent except for the ticking of a clock I did not remember buying. when the pressure in my chest shifted suddenly, not increasing but aligning, like a lock clicking open. And in that moment I knew where I needed to go, not because I was being forced, but because the question of whether or not to go had been removed. I drove without headlights for the last mile. The road was visible anyway, lit by a pale ambient glow that did not come from the sky. And when I stepped out of the car, the smell of Red Creek wrapped around me like recognition rather than warning. The air thick and still and heavy with that familiar metallic dampness that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with memory. The clearing was there, exactly as it had been in the dreams, the trees arranged in a wide, deliberate ring, the ground worn smooth at the center, and as I stepped into it, I felt the pressure inside me ease for the first time since 1959, replaced by a sense of alignment so profound it made my eyes sting. The Red Creek wolf emerged without drama. No rush, no sound. It stepped into the clearing already upright, already complete. Its form unmistakable now, scars visible, fur matted and uneven, eyes dark and absorbing. And when it looked at me, I felt no fear at all, only the deep, unsettling certainty that this was the moment everything had been moving toward. It did not touch me. It did not need to. The pressure in my chest surged outward, spreading through my ribs and shoulders, and I dropped to my knees, not because I was weak, but because standing was no longer appropriate. And in that position, I finally understood what had been taken from us and why. It was not choice, it was resistance. The Red Creek wolf did not remove the heart. It removed the part of us that refused alignment, the part that struggled against the role it was meant to play. And as I knelt there, breathing in time with something far larger than myself, I felt the last remaining tension drain away, leaving behind a stillness that was terrifying not because it hurt, but because it felt correct. I was found at the edge of Red Creek 2 days later, standing upright and unmoving, my clothes clean, my body intact, my chest unopened, and when they spoke to me, I responded politely, calmly, answering questions with just enough coherence to satisfy their concern, because there was no reason to frighten them with explanations they were not prepared to receive. The doctors found nothing wrong, no abnormalities, no damage, no absence they could measure. That was the most unsettling part. Life resumed in a way that looked normal from the outside, which is how these things survive, how they integrate, how they wait. And I returned home and sat at my kitchen table and listened to the ticking clock that no longer bothered me, because I could hear something beneath it now, something slower, deeper, more patient, a rhythm that matched my own when I allowed it to. The others were never found, not the rest of the survivors, not the ones who vanished quietly. Their names faded from records, their stories condensed into footnotes and rumors, and eventually nothing at all. And Red Creek was closed off, fenced, marked with signs that warned of environmental instability and unsafe terrain, which was close enough to the truth to be effective. I stayed away. I did not need to return, because Red Creek was no longer a place. It was a process. Sometimes, late at night, I feel the pressure again, faint but familiar, and I understand that it is not a summons but a reminder, a confirmation that the work continues elsewhere, that other land will reach readiness, that other groups of men will mistake silence for emptiness and step willingly into selection. I tell this story not as a warning. Warnings assume prevention. I tell it because survival is not what you think it is. Some of us are spared because we escape. Others are spared because we are changed. And a very small number are spared because we are needed. If you are listening to this and you feel something tightening in your chest, something aligning rather than resisting, then understand this. The Red Creek wolf is not gone. It is not hunting. It is waiting. And when the land is ready again, it will not have to come looking. It will already know where to find you. If you made it to the end of this story, then understand something carefully. This was not entertainment. It was a record. Places like Red Creek do not disappear. They close. They wait. They resurface under different names. Most people believe monsters hunt randomly. They are wrong. The most dangerous ones observe, select, and return only when the conditions are right. If this story unsettled you, do not dismiss that feeling. Fear is not always a warning. Sometimes it is recognition. Subscribe if you want the stories that never make it into official reports. The ones survivors struggle to explain. The ones that follow people home. And remember this: if something ever feels like it is waiting for you, rather than chasing you, it is already closer than you think. Good night.